We're live. Okay, well, good evening. Good evening and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library's series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Gary Kruns. Welcome to our online audience and our in-person audience here at the Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory. We're glad you could make it here this evening. I also, of course, want to welcome tonight's guest, Deirdre De La Cruz, and I'll introduce her in a moment. But first, I want to say that as the archives of the University of Michigan, the Bentley Library acknowledges that the historical origins and present locations of the university were made possible by cession of lands by Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples under coercive treaties common in the colonization and expansion of the United States. We note in particular the grant of land made by the Anishinaabe under the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids for the College at Detroit so that their children could be educated. These lands continue to be the homeland of indigenous people, and we seek to reaffirm and respect their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and to recognize their contributions to the university. Now, tonight we're going to examine an aspect of university history that makes the archives and other collections at the university not only sources of information, but also subjects of interrogation. U of M's involvement in the Philippines during the U.S. colonial period, the ways in which it contributed to the nation's imperial ambitions and actions, and how it brought to the university vast collections of documents, artifacts, and specimens. And we're also going to, of course, look at efforts now underway to address that history in a meaningful way. Our speaker, Deirdre De La Cruz, is co-PI for Reconnect, Recollect, Reparative Connections to Philippine Collections at the University of Michigan. She is Associate Professor of History and of Asian Languages and Cultures here at U of M. She is an historian and cultural anthropologist of the Philippines with an interest in the transformation of religious sensibilities, beliefs, and phenomena in modernity. Deirdre is the author of the book Mother Figured, Marian Apparitions and the Making of a Filipino Universal, and several articles on religion in the Philippines. And her current projects include work on history of faith healing, as well as two plays, I guess, on World War II, Filipinos who fought in World War II, and another that tells the history of Christianity through the eyes of its apostates. And of course, in the last few years, she has been focused on the subject of tonight's talk. So Deirdre, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary, for that wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be speaking, first of all, in person, and also at this incredible facility of the Detroit Observatory. I wanted to thank the Bentley Historical Library and Gary for welcoming me and for inviting me to this series, Making Michigan. I'd like to thank a hearty and heartfelt thank you to the Reconnect, Recollect team, several of whom are in the room. I think there are a couple who are watching from afar. And I also really want to thank all of our institutional partners with the project that I will describe later on. It's because of being able to build really trusting relationships with a number of different collections across campus that we have been able to do some of the reparative work that we are currently undertaking. So I want to begin by introducing you to Mateo Francisco. Arguably one of the most important, yet without a doubt the least known, figure in the long history of the relationship between the Philippines and the University of Michigan. Mateo Francisco was born on August 23rd, 1862, in the village of Ayala on the Zamboangan Peninsula on the island of Mindanao. In 1875, at the tender age of 14, Francisco made the long journey to Ann Arbor, Michigan. He was brought by U of M alumnus and naturalist Joseph Beale Steer, whose world tour between 1870 and 1875 amassed collections that would transform the U of M's University Museum. For 12 years, Mateo lived under Steer's custodianship, somewhere between Ann Arbor, Ionia, where the Steers had a home, and Pittsfield, where the Sprawling family had a farm. We don't yet know whether Mateo attended school or perhaps worked on Steer's farm, or perhaps worked and assisted Steer in the University Museum, of which Steer was made curator. What we do know is that by the time Mateo returned to the Philippines with Steer's second Philippine expedition in 1887, he returned as a naturalized citizen of the United States. And we think Mateo Francisco might be the person at the left, at the far left, but I'm not sure we know for sure. We don't know for sure if this is him, but I will. This is the iconic image of that second expedition, so I will put up the image there. Back in the Philippines, Mateo Francisco proved to be an indispensable member of the Second Philippine Expedition, not least because he was a skilled tracker and hunter, and Steer's expeditions were geared toward the collection of zoological and botanical specimens. On the island of Mindoro, Francisco accomplished what Steer had journeyed to the island to capture, the legendary but elusive tamarau, a dwarf buffalo endemic to the islands. The story of this hunt tells how Francisco ventured out alone before daybreak, accompanied only by his Winchester rifle. He followed fresh tracks across the river until he spotted a tamarau drinking from the bed of the stream. 7 shots later, and the beast was dead. Francisco succeeded in tracking and killing 2 more of the unique animal, even staying behind while Steer very comfortably took the steamship back to Manila. When the 3 bovine, this fictive tamarau family, returned to Ann Arbor, they were taxidermied and displayed in the University Museum. They made another appearance at the 1893 Chicago Columbian Expedition. Now, the Second Philippine Expedition marked only the beginning of the long career that Mateo Francisco had collaborating with U of M faculty and alumni in building zoological, botanical, and archaeological collections, even though he never returned to the United States, at least as far as we know so far. In 1890, Francisco accompanied U of M alumnus Dean C. Worcester and the American ornithologist Frank Burns in yet another expedition that lasted almost 3 years. Traces of Francisco in the archive diminished somewhat during the transition that saw the Philippines transferred from Spanish to American colonial rule via the brutal Philippine-American War. This is the period when the University of Michigan's production of knowledge about the Philippines in the late 19th century was instrumentalized towards colonial rule. U of M alumni, including Worcester, James Leroy, and others, wielded both camera and pen in sustained efforts to depict Filipinos as incapable of self-rule, as they themselves assumed powerful positions in the American colonial government. But Mateo Francisco didn't disappear for long. In the late 1910s, Worcester, after leaving public office to pursue more lucrative business ventures in the islands, approached U of M President Harry Hutchins and classicist Francis Kelsey about sponsoring a major archaeological expedition to the Philippines. Mateo Francisco, when Hutchins and Kelsey in turn convinced the archaeologist Carl Gutha to run the expedition, Mateo Francisco re-enters the archival scene. Tapped by Worcester, who very tellingly calls him his Man Friday, to serve as translator, community liaison, native informant, and hunter, only this time the hunt wasn't for exotic flora and fauna, but rather artifacts. In the southern part of Mindanao, where photos suggest Francisco returned and settled with his family, we see him working with the archaeologist Gutha, accompanying him to various homes where locals obtained or kept artifacts of potential interest. And these are field notes that are taken from Carl Gutha. These are a selection of his field notes, and they show that Gutha was very often accompanied by Francisco in some of his expeditions, at least in this part of the Philippines. And I want to say a little bit of something just about the one on the left. I was having a conversation with an archivist the other day who, reminded me that there is indigenous knowledge throughout colonial archives. And this is, I think, a really good example of this, even though it's so tantalizingly small. It says here, a Chinese ceramic specimen, Siocon Bay, Zamboanga Peninsula, in the house of Mateo Francisco. So this was an object that Mateo Francisco himself either had possession of or someone gave to him. And it says, a small globular jug had been found in the ground following the directions given in a dream. We don't know anything else about this, but there are these little tidbits of information that one can gather that we could think of as kind of local knowledge. In any case, Francisco accompanied Goethe to various homes where local people obtained or kept artifacts of potential interest. And his participation in the Goethe expedition from 1922 to 1925 bookended an almost 50-year relationship with the U of M, a relationship that outlived most of the careers of his American counterparts, including that of Worcester, who died in the midst of Goethe's expedition in 1924. So, for a half a century, Mateo Francisco contributed to the U of M's collecting endeavors, to the making of the Philippine collections as we know it. Yet there are no specimen or collections named after him, much less archival or museum institutions. He was never conferred an honorary degree. His name doesn't even appear in any finding aids. The fact that he appears at all in the historical record as a real person is an exception to an archive in which it is easy to find Filipinos reduced to racialized types, but hard to find Filipinos represented in any fully fleshed, three-dimensional human complexity with agency, with voice, with a range of motivations, with their own lived experiences of empire. So I titled this talk A Difficult Archive for a number of reasons, the first of which I hope is captured with this introduction. By difficult here, I mean to point to the challenges of reading against and between and along the grain of biases inherent in the archive itself, the history of the founding of these collections and how this history is told, the way that these collections are organized, and the erasures and silences produced because of it. If the story of Mateo Francisco is an unexpected point of entry into the University of Michigan and some of its most renowned archival and museum collections, it's because the very structure of these collections organizes in advance a historical telling that fundamentally privileges white, male, and in the case of the Philippines, colonial perspectives. Colonial actors are centered in the archive through the simplest act of naming the collections after them, and in repeating those names over and over again in our citational practice, in our scholarly work, in our publication, as much as in casual consultation. Finding aids and other cataloging and descriptive tools reinforce this, relegating Filipino subjects to the dense and hidden interior of a collection, where even if you can locate them, they often appear as secondary characters, as racial epithets, as Man Fridays. And I want to be really careful here that I'm not appearing to cast aspersions on our incredible archivists who, face these challenges, know these challenges more than anyone, and are navigating them and negotiating them every day. My point is that these colonial logics are baked into archival praxis and our scholarly practice, and that's something that we think about a lot in the project that I will describe later. We see these logics further in how the Philippine collections at the U of M not only are internally arranged, labeled, described, and cataloged, but also in how they are distributed across campus. So, for example, the extraordinary collection of Philippine botanical and zoological specimen that Francisco helped acquire sits in the University Museum of Zoology and Herbarium, which is at the Research Museum Center in South Ann Arbor. Photographs of Philippine ethno-linguistic groups from the early 20th century that share geographical and cultural connections to those specimens are in the University Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, the Bentley Historical Library, and the Special Collections Research Center. The rich and varied collection of Philippine and indigenous material culture that is also at the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology is separated from some of the documentation that might help us better identify to whom such artifacts belong, for whom they held meaning, and what those meanings were. And this is just to speak of the biggest collections of Philippine materials that exist on campus. Now you'll notice here I'm trying a little experiment, which is to describe the collections as Philippine collections rather than to go immediately to the names of those collections, which are the names of some of these colonial actors. There are other collections that document the Philippine-American War, the transformation of Philippine education, Philippine governmental, agricultural, and public health systems in the early 20th century. Collections focused on the Philippines are scattered across campus, in part because of the disciplinary divisions whose genealogies are in Western knowledge production, which is very often colonial knowledge production. And because with the history of a lot of these collections, it's almost as if the Philippines as an organizing category is sort of unthinkable, right? That they have to be organized first by the person who collected them, who brought them back. And even though they might have to do predominantly with the Philippines, to consider the Philippines as the organizing rubric is at least historically sort of unfathomable, which is, I find so interesting. There is no one place or one physical location where all Philippine collections are kept. And I often get asked this by people who are like, well, can we go and see the Philippine collections? And as if it's in one place. And I have to say, it's in 8 different institutions plus across campus. So, you know, this is another way that I think of the U of M's Philippine collections as difficult, which is in their sheer breadth and their distribution across institutions on campus that may not always speak to one another. And even if these institutions speak to one another, they don't have compatible tools of access or cataloging tools that allow people to find things according to Philippine categories. This is where the decentralization that I think at Michigan we so appreciate actually becomes a real barrier to accessibility and can make it challenging to discover materials in the first place. So what I want to do here is just give you a moment to take in the sheer diversity, breadth, and mass of the collections that are here at the U of M. And I want to give a shout out, you know, as I go through this, I want to acknowledge all of the members of our team who have participated in putting some of these things together. And our PhD student, Robert Diaz, who's here in the front row, helped put together this incredible infographic, which I think really says so much. For me, this is like the visual and kind of wishful imagining of what it would mean to unite all of the Philippine collections, right? Sort of in one place. What if they could all be also like in one place? Even if we know that it's probably never going to happen. The third way that I think of the Philippine collections at the U of M as constituting a difficult archive is simply in their very content. And this is maybe the way that most people think of offensive materials in the archive and museum collections. Difficult too, even in their sheer existence here, in their having been taken or their displacement from the Philippines. Now, this is an issue, as many of you know, that's really roiled the museum's world, especially in countries that were former colonial powers. And the Philippine collections at U of M are not exempt, or at least should not be exempt from those really difficult conversations. In case you haven't noticed, Michigan is a really long way from the Philippines. It's far from the Philippines. And there is nothing either natural or neutral about the collections being here. There's also little question that many of the cultural objects in our collections and the photographs that have been taken were taken without consent of the communities to whom they belonged. And in the case of some of the material objects, they were taken from burial sites. There are, furthermore, photographic collections that have been incredibly generative for critical scholarship on empire and for ethnohistorical use, but again, are without a doubt exploitative, and especially those photographic collections that depict indigenous peoples. There are also deeply racist descriptions of Filipinos and explicit photographs of violence and brutality against Filipinos in our collections, in particular of the Philippine-American War and the colonial police state that followed. So there are scores of images of dead Filipinos on the battlefield, of Filipinos having been hanged, images that many of us, not just those of us of Filipino descent, find not just offensive, but, quite frankly, traumatic. So what I've outlined here under this rubric of the difficult archive is essentially a description of what I and others see as some of the most significant harms of and in these collections. And what I want to do now, this is like the happier part of the, of the story, is to turn to ways that I and others have set about working to repair some of those harms. And I want to say that a lot of what I've presented in these first few minutes of the talk are really things that I've learned quite recently. I mean, the ways that archives are organized according to colonial logics is something that we've been thinking about a lot in history, but how it works here at the U of M. And I just want to say that there's a kind of collective learning that's been happening as part of this project that I'm about to introduce. And that everything that I'm going to present about the Reconnect, Recollect project is work in progress, right? We don't claim to be the definitive experts on what constitutes harm in our collections or even in the best ways to repair harm. As my colleague and co-PI, Ricky Punzalan, likes to remind me, it took decades to build these collections and all of the harm inherent in them, so it will take a long time and is a matter of slow work to undo the harm in them. So let me move on to Reconnect, Recollect. This is a project that properly started out a couple of years ago through the Humanities Collaboratory at the U of M. They have this series, what they call 5 by 5, where a group of 5 faculty members or curators and or curators come together and have a conversation over the course of a year around a project. So we participated in this, and then we were supported by the Humanities Collaboratory in a development grant over the summer, where we really started to refine what a project addressing harm and developing reparative approaches to our collections might look like. We did this with a number of listening sessions. So various constituencies, Philippine and Filipino-American studies scholars, curators, archivists, and collection managers on campus, of course, archivists and collection managers who were doing already reparative work at their institutions, representatives of indigenous communities. And this summer work led to envisioning a much larger project that we pitched to the Humanities Collaboratory, and they thankfully and very generously funded us. So big shout out, I don't know who's out there in the Humanities Collaboratory world, but we're so appreciative of that support. I should also say that this project builds on, it didn't come out of nowhere, that there has been years of critical examination of the collections at U of M, scholars who have written critically about some of the colonial origins of our collections, graduate students who have, through their own activism on campus, drawn folks' attention to these collections. It's just that the time was right to bring together a collective of people to really tackle this. And again, as I said at the beginning of the talk, a project like this only works because we have built very strong relationships with the other archive and museum collections on campus. And there is a shared sense institutionally that, self-reflection and self-critique around the history of the university is the right thing to do. So, who is part of Reconnect, Recollect? This is where I get to, show off like all of the wonderful people that are working on the project. Of course, there's my co-PI, Ricky Punzalan, and Kirsten Barnt, who is faculty in museum studies and Germanic studies, and who is the person who has done the most research on Mateo Francisco. And at least to my knowledge, the only person who has actually written and published about Francisco. We have wonderful students, the majority of whom are graduate students from American culture, history, anthropology and history, anthropology, the School of Information. We have a community liaison who was a graduate of U of M and a Filipino-American, lives in Ann Arbor. And we have collection directors and managers, those who are really our partners in, thinking through some of these issues, like Nancy Bartlett, who is here from the Bentley Historical Library, is the interim dean there, Martha O'Hara Conway from the Special Collections Research Center, and Jim Moss, who's a collections manager at the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology. And last, but certainly not least, and perhaps most importantly, we have an external advisory board. So we have a number of people, multi-generational, Philippine-based and US-based, an advisory board comprised of scholars, archivists, archaeologists, representatives from indigenous communities in the Philippines, and community organizers. And they really, as I was telling Gary earlier, they keep us in check, I think. So what is the focus of Reconnect, Recollect? We have 3 pillars, what we think of as 3 areas of activity. The first is reparative curation. And I think that the work of reparative curation starts with the recognition that words and categories matter, right? That how historical events, people, and cultural objects are described can perpetuate racism and colonialist ideas or structures, and can dismantle them or can mitigate some of these structures. So among some of the first things that we've done is to conduct, and again, this is all done sort of collectively, an extensive survey of Philippine collections across institutions. And that's how we're able to get that fabulous infographic that gives us some sense, not necessarily a comprehensive sense, but a pretty good sense of what we have on campus that's related to the Philippines. Following up on that, the Reconnect team has conducted a survey, continues to conduct a survey across 3 major archival collections, so the Bentley Historical Library, Special Collections Research Center, and the Clements Library, to try to identify common terms that today might seem offensive for how they depict and misrepresent Filipinos, indigenous peoples in the Philippines, and aspects or events of Philippine history, and language that celebrates colonialism, or the U of M's role in it. So we see harmful language at both the levels of content and at the levels of summary description, sometimes in our collection. So what we have here is work that's being done by some of our reparative description team, who's developing a glossary of harmful language. And again, some of this language is really obvious. So language that describes primitive versus civilized is really obvious. But there's language, too, that is maybe not so obvious without context. So the one example that I always like to give is the term insurgent, right? This, outside of context, is a term that, doesn't necessarily mean anything offensive. But in the history of the early 20th century Philippines, the Americans' use of the term insurgent suggests that those Filipinos who continued to fight for their independence from Spain and then against the Americans were doing so illegitimately. Insurgent is a term that delegitimizes the efforts of Filipino revolutionaries. So context is often the key to determining whether terminology is harmful or benign. And all of this is the kind of work that we're doing in what we could think of largely as reparative description. Again, a lot of this is really subtle. So this is an excerpt from a finding aid at the Bentley of the Dean Worcester papers. This is, again, the descriptive tool that one would use to first look at what's covered in the Worcester papers. And here we have terms like exciting, like the exciting prospect of American colonialism in the Philippines, or the Philippines as American colony. We have the term insurgency. We have the phrase benevolent assimilation, which was the ideological platform of the early imperialists. But we have it without we have it without scare quotes. We have it as if it's already sort of a naturalized idea. So this real deep dive and careful look at language and how language is depicting history, this colonial history, and depicting Filipinos is some of the work that's being done. Also, as a part of our reparative curation work at the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology in particular, is a fabulous GIS mapping project that is being done by one of our graduate students in anthropology, Nick Trudeau, under the supervision of our collections manager, Jim Moss. And this is I can't really pretend to understand the technology here. So I actually asked Nick can you just give me some language about what this is actually doing? I get it, but I couldn't describe it myself. And what Nick suggested is, the way to describe it is that, the purpose of this mapping project is to create a database for searching, referencing, and analyzing the archaeological collections, to provide a visual representation of the archaeological collections. And I think this is really important, to understand the spatial and cultural relationship of collections to diverse ethno-linguistic groups. So at the end of the day, this, again, slow work. This is not going to happen overnight. This is not rolling out next week. But the idea is that, this could live online, and then anyone from anywhere, most especially from the Philippines, could look at the collections and see how they map spatially onto different parts of the Philippines and different ethno-linguistic groups. Finally, and without a doubt, the most sensitive aspect of reparative curation are conversations around the existence of Philippine human remains in our collections. This is something that, again, is very careful work. And one of the things that we'll be doing over the course of this year is holding a number of listening sessions with all of the stakeholders for whom the existence of these remains in our collection is meaningful. Right? So this would include not only community groups in the Philippines, but also archaeologists, curators, people who have worked and navigated some of these issues with Philippine human remains, and of course, some of our institutional partners on campus. The second pillar of what we do is reparative connections to community, and I'm looking at the time and I'm going to try to speed up a little bit, but I don't want to gloss over this, because this is also such incredibly rich and valuable experience. I was going to say work, but it's more than work. It's a real experience for us. Over the last year and through this year, the Reconnect team is piloting a series of programs that are designed to build important ties between our collections and Filipino and Filipino-American communities here at home, in the diaspora, and in the Philippines. So simply letting community members know about our collections is a major goal of our efforts. So we focus a lot on outreach and education. Among the different things that we've done is host an artist residency last May, where we brought 3 fantastic US-based Filipino artists to engage our collections. Francis Estrada, Maya Cruz Palaleo, and Jana Año Nuevo Langholtz. And this was so incredibly rich for us, because it gave us this wonderful opportunity to better understand the value of our collections for non-scholars, right? Their appreciation, their interpretation, their critique, their recontextualization of our Philippine materials, showed us yet another way of thinking about repair. And it also served as a kind of open invitation for other non-scholars, including artists, to engage the collection. So again, part of the basic work of what we want to do is simply let people know the collections are here, and let people know, and especially folks of Filipino descent, know that they could engage these collections, right? They don't have to be members of the university or academics and so forth. We're planning a Residency 2.0 for later spring this year, where we hope to bring from the Philippines artisans and artists and cultural practitioners to do something similar to what these 3 artists did in May. Another thing that we did, and those of you who are in person can come and pick up some of the postcards that we produced for this event. This was an Independence Day celebration, Kalayaan, which is in June 12th of every year. And this was the largest gathering of Filipinos in the state of Michigan. There are some Filipinos who came from Indiana and Ohio. We co-sponsored the event. We set up a table that provided at least visual examples of our collections. We had an interactive map that you can see at the vertical banner over there, where visitors could identify where they came from, where their origins are, where their roots are on the map, and then see what items of the collections pertain to those places of origin. We had like this fun sort of quiz where visitors could test, or kind of in a fun way, their knowledge of Filipino language and of concepts and of objects. And through this, we were able to put our collections before a really wide audience of Filipino and Filipino Americans, and basically spark interest too in Philippine history. Most recently, we connected our collections to one of the most important constituencies on campus for us, which is the Filipino American students. So we had a wonderfully curated open house that was the work of Bentley archivist Diana Bachman, one of our graduate students, Chad Kamen, and Jim Moss at UMA. And this will serve as a model for future open houses later in the year. And we continue to build connections to really try to reconnect again the collections to communities through talks, through community visits and so forth. The last piece that is still really undeveloped, because this is partly what comes after we're done with our 2-year grant, is Reparative Scholarship. This is the 3rd pillar of our work. And so some of the things that I think we can anticipate coming out of this work are co-authored articles, conference presentations. We've been giving conference presentations nationally, including internationally. Tomorrow I have to record a talk that's going to be for a Philippine National Museums conference on Monday about the Reconnect project. And then one of the biggest things that we want to produce out of this is a kind of toolkit for other institutions with Philippine collections that would like to do something similar to Reconnect. And on that toolkit, or as a part of that toolkit, there will be the Glossary of Harmful Language, there will be the models for public engagement and community consultation, there'll be some recommendations for reparative protocols for different collections, and other sorts of resources. So that's the end of Reconnect. Before we finish, I want to just say a little bit more about another project that, for me, was really the beginning of thinking reparatively about these collections. And this is a Michigan in the World project. Michigan in the World is a collaboration between the Bentley Historical Library and the History Department here at U of M. And I led an iteration of Michigan in the World that focused on this history of the Philippines and the U of M a few years ago. So this brought us 6 very talented undergraduates. They were named Bentley Fellows. They were paid 30 hours a week for 8 weeks to do original research at the Bentley Historical Library and write the essays that you find here on the website. For many students, this was their first encounter with archival research. It was also the first time many students even learned about this history between the U of M and the Philippines. And we did a lot of grappling with, what it means to do this work when you're at an institution with this history. I've learned since this website was published that there have been teachers that have used this website in some of their teaching. There was a faculty member from Hawaii who reached out to me a couple years ago and wanted permission to use some of the material on here for a curriculum she was developing around the Pacific world. So this has been a really valuable project for me as an educator, and one of the great things is that it serves as a foundation for more research that can be done by students. So I'm teaching a class right now that's a history lab. We have about 10 students who are going back into the archives, this time not just the Bentley, but also the Special Collections, the Clements, and the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, doing that research, writing these original essays, and this resource will continue to grow every time I teach this course, which is just incredibly valuable. What's different about this history class that I'm teaching right now is that unlike when we first did this for Michigan in the World, we're almost exclusively focusing on trying to find Filipino subjects in the archive and really bring out some of those Filipino voices. So we have a student that is working, Chelsea is right here, working on Santiago Arteaga, who was a pensionado scholarship student who came in the early 20th century. And we have a student who is working on Mateo Francisco. So finally, after 150 years, Mateo Francisco will get his due on this website. And that's all I have to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. That was wonderful.
Do I sit down?
Why don't you sit for a
Okay.
minute? We can chat, and then we can open it up to the audience, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions. First of all, I'm really happy that you brought up the Michigan in the World project and the website. I really highly recommend it. And I wonder if we could, if just to start, because we tend to have a very mixed audience for these events, and I'm sure a lot of people are relatively familiar with the history of U.S. colonialism in the Philippines, but others maybe not so much. So I wonder if we could just have a very brief, basic history lesson. You know, starting.
Sure.
I mean, this is where American colonialism, at least extracontinental colonialism, kind of starts, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I think of Michigan as the center for producing knowledge about the Philippines, even before the American colonial period. And then that becomes, it just increases during the American colonial period. So after the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris between Spain and the United States ends up ceding the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. At the same time, you have the continued fight of Filipino revolutionaries who thought that the Americans were going to help them against Spain. That turned out not to be the case, and so then these Filipino revolutionaries continue the fight against Americans. The University of Michigan's role in this is varied. I think some of the groundwork is laid with Joseph Beale Steer, because it's from those expeditions that there are people who participate, like Dean Worcester. Dean Worcester, who was on the Second Philippine Expedition, then becomes the Secretary of the Interior for the colonial government. There are other University of Michigan alumni and faculty who are not only advising the American colonial government, but also assuming positions in the American colonial government. So there's just this real intimacy historically between the U of M and the American Imperial Project, which is a knowledge production project, but also the actual colonial government. And I hope that sort of
that's
gives
great.
it.
That's perfect. So it is that sort of a connect. I mean, I've heard it said that
it's explicit.
In some,
yeah,
well, yes,
there are smoking guns.
Right. No, I
all
see.
over the archives
And
of
in
that
some,
collection.
these collections that we have here may be the largest, well, at least at a university.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really extraordinary about the collections is just their sheer diversity.
Yeah.
You know, there are other colonial collections that are archival collections. There are other places that have, photographic collections, but just that long genealogy of Michigan expeditions and then, the so-called Michigan men and then faculty who are, throughout the American colonial period, going and either in an advisory capacity or a collecting capacity, bringing Filipinos, also bringing collections here. It's just such an incredibly varied and deep and wide set of materials that we have here that I think are unparalleled in that sheer breadth and diversity.
You also mentioned a student now working on the pensionados, and I wonder if you could say just a little bit about those kinds of connections with U of M, and the Barber Scholars, for instance, as well.
Right, yeah. That's all part of the colonial project, which was to, these early imperialists like Dean Worcester, they didn't think that Filipinos were capable of self-rule. They had quite a lot of disdain for the elite intelligentsia. And so, part of what at least the stated goal was to, give Filipinos the tools to eventually be able to govern themselves. So part of that toolkit were exchanges or scholarships like the Pensionado Act that was passed in the first years of the 20th century that brought largely Filipino elites to universities in the United States, not just the U of M, but a number of different universities in the US, so that they could receive training in an American-style education, with the idea being that they would go back to the Philippines and then assume positions in the colonial government. So the American colonial government had very early on established bodies that would be occupied by Filipinos. And so the Pensionado program, the Barber Scholarship is a little bit different just because that was focused on women and not just women from the Philippines, although there were Filipino women who came as part of the Barber Scholar program. Those were all programs that were part of the American colonial project to train Filipinos and largely Filipino elites in being able to occupy other positions of power.
So maybe I could just ask one more question, and then could open to the audience. And Austin, if we could have somebody with a microphone. Great, thank you. So this is about Reconnect, Recollect. What's the prehistory? What was the impetus that sort of started you or you and Ricky on this path? To get into this?
It's a funny question because I'm not really a scholar. I'm not really a historian of U.S. empire. It's real weird. It's like I work on the Philippines. I work on religion, and even though I've been here 16 years, I think there's always part of me that was like, I don't want to do, it's too much. Like I don't want to, I'm really a Philippine-based scholar, but it gets you anyway. The archives get you anyway. Part of this comes out of, I think, conversations that Ricky Punzalan, my co-PI, had early on with Nancy Bartlett, who is now the interim director of the Bentley Historical Library. Ricky did his PhD here. I don't really want to say how long ago because I'm afraid I might be embarrassing myself, but not too long ago. In recent history, he did his PhD here about the Dean Worcester collections and the photographic collections and also the archival collections. So it's really Ricky and Nancy and some of the other curators who had been thinking about doing this kind of work. And then Ricky was the one who approached me, and he said, "Do you want to do this?" And I was like, "Oh, I guess I'm going to be dragged kicking and screaming finally into the U.S. Imperial Archives." And I am so glad because, not only just the learning that I have done, working on Michigan in the World and working on the Reconnect project about Philippine American history, that I had, enough knowledge of, but, not really in-depth knowledge of. The understanding now I have of archival history and archival practice is really so deep and rich. But it's really, I'm gonna blame Ricky and Nancy in part for getting me involved. But I'm so glad that they did. And now, we'll see what happens after this year. But there's no question that I'll always continue to be using these collections to teach and to engage with community.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So, you know, obviously, if you're in the audience here, then please raise your hand, and we'd like to have you use the microphone so that we are sure to capture it. If you're online, you can enter a question into the chat, and Andrew here will raise it for us.
Can I ask too, if you do ask a question, can you just say your name and, you know, say a little bit about where you're coming from? That's always really helpful for me.
Hi, Carla Goldman. I teach in Judaic Studies and Social Work.
Hi.
Just this is a real quick question. I was interested in, you had dwelling as a colonial term. If you could say a little bit about why. And then the other question was, in terms of the Barber Scholars and those other, was there any positive aspect of it for the students who were here? Because, I mean, it's interesting to see those students showing up.
Yeah.
And say the yearbooks and the, you know,
Yeah.
and the kind of the groupness that they have within the university where you wouldn't expect to see them maybe.
Right. The first question, I don't know if I could really take that question because I have not been a part of the project that is developing the glossary of harmful language. You know, I think a lot of these terms, they're not necessarily offensive, but they just require more context, right? And so words like, I'm trying to remember what other words were there, dwelling, I'm looking right at Robert, because Robert is, maybe Robert, you can help answer that question.
Sure, so, yeah, I'll take it.
This is Robert Diaz, he's one of our PhD students.
Yes, no, and so part of it is that, just like Deirdre said, the issue for a lot of these terms is that if you just look at them, they don't seem inherently harmful. But something like dwelling is a blanket term that and used in a lot of the finding aids and by colonists in their own collections that sort of overlook the nuances and the diversity of houses of different living structures in the Philippines, and that's where a lot of the harm stems from as well. The fact that so much context, so much nuance is lost in the way that these things are described. And yet, when you look at the perspective from the colonists who were there, that becomes incredibly nuanced. That becomes incredibly detailed, right? So there's an imbalance in terms of what's described on one end versus the other. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of terms like that. As for the pensionados and like the Barber Scholars, yeah, I mean, there's no question that, you know, out of sociality or out of necessity, they found each other here. And there are sources that point to, you know, like the formation of like clubs and so forth. I often wonder, you know, in a kind of empathetic mode, like what it must have been like to be a Filipino here in 1903 or 1904, and how alienating it might have been, or how, you know, foreign, or, you know. So in terms of other benefits, I guess, from these opportunities, I mean, they did contribute to the social and political positioning of these people in the Philippines, right? So again, and even with like, well, Mateo Francisco I think is a little bit different, but that these were elites. And I think we don't want to lose sight of the fact that, you know, there are a lot of Filipino elites during the American colonial period who are very intentionally and strategically positioning themselves to benefit from political power. So yeah, while they're here, that's actually one of the things that one of our students is trying to research more, like what was student life like? It's tough to find sources, but there are enough to be able to put together where they lived, what they did, if they hung out together, and so forth. Thanks.
I think we have an online question.
Yes. Veronica asks, I was a grad student activist at U of M demanding repatriation of Native ancestors. How can Native American communities support efforts to get your ancestors out of U of M museums?
That's a great question. Thank you. So you know, I mean, this is a question about repatriation, right? And the repatriation of objects, but I think most ethically fraught is the existence of human remains on campus, and the question of whether or not those can be repatriated. Personally, I'll speak personally for a moment. I think repatriation is always one possible solution to the existence of human remains in collections. I also recognize that it is one of a range of solutions, and that the key is in figuring out what communities of dissent want. And that is not fast work. That is not fast work. So, you know, on the one hand, I think it could be fairly easy to say, you know, it's the right thing to do. On the other hand, I think we have to be really careful that we're not making decisions as if Reconnect has no, you know, authority to make any decisions in any case, right? But just hypothetically speaking, that we're not making decisions without community consultation. Like that's the bottom line. So that's, you know, one of the reasons why you know, we're holding these conversations and trying to identify who those interlocutors should be to help us better understand what it means that these human remains are here. And to assume that we know what it means that they're here without having talked to communities of dissent, I feel like it's its own form of, you know, it can just go south really quick. So I think community consultation is key. Being able to understand what communities of dissent want is really key. And that work has to be done before, I think, the question of repatriation is put forth. The other thing is physical return of objects is not the only form of repatriation that exists. And there are other forms of repatriation, including intellectual repatriation, digital repatriation, and it really just comes down to what those communities most connected with those remains, with those ancestors, with those objects themselves desire. But thanks for the question. It's really important.
Others from the audience here? Yes, over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, pardon me.
Pat Seitzer, Astronomy. Is there a biography of Dean Worcester that you can recommend?
There are a couple of really, well, there's one biography that's by Rodney Sullivan. I'm blanking on the name now. Does anybody know what that biography? Rodney Sullivan. Rodney Sullivan is the first. And that was published, I think, in the 1980s. And then there was a book that came out about 5 or 6 years ago by Mark Rice that's called Dean Worcester's Fantasy Islands, I think. And it's mostly about the photographic archive of Worcester, but it definitely touches on some biographical aspects of his life. Yeah, Rodney Sullivan is the, yeah.
And Ricky Punzalan's dissertation.
And Ricky Punzalan's dissertation, of course. He's so close to my heart that, like, sometimes I forget. Ricky Punzalan's dissertation, the name of which also is escaping me now. But those are the big three. So Sullivan, Punzalan, and Mark Rice. What's your name?
I'm Tyler. I'm a freshman here at the U of M. And I was wondering if you think that, like, collections like the ones that we have here at the U of M or generally from the Philippines are also reductive of, like, the variance in cultures of the Philippines, like the Muslim history in Mindanao and, like, the more like dedicated Catholicism in urban areas versus, like, a mix of indigenous religions and Catholicism in, like, more rural areas. And I was wondering what you think, like, American attitudes or, like, museum collections do to address that or don't do to address that.
Yeah, okay, so let me see if I understand your question. It's a question of whether or not the diversity of the Philippines is represented accurately in the collections?
Yeah, like the diversity in culture and, like, particularly, like, religious tradition in our collection.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I think not well enough is the answer. Not well enough, and I think that's part of the work that we're trying to do. I want to make, really clear that like 2 years is not a lot of time, and remedying or repairing is a, sometimes I think it's a career-long project. I mean, there's so much stuff here that doing the work of repair is going to take a really long time. I think what we're trying to do now is to try to assess exactly how flattened out some of that diversity is, including how inaccurate some of the descriptions of that diversity is. But, I mean, like, I'm not an expert in all things Philippines, all, ethno-linguistic groups and so forth. And so, again, that work is going to take a long time to find out who the right people to consult with on nomenclature, on the sacrality of, on whether objects are sacred, on what to do with certain kinds of objects. That's going to be work that is going to take a while. Yeah.
Online question? This is a competition too, by the way, between
Yeah.
the room and online.
I'm kind of going back and forth.
Barb asks, how difficult is it to get agreement from different communities as to how they would like to proceed regarding repatriation? Is there a balancing act?
How difficult is it to get agreement?
To get agreement from different communities.
Oh, I see. So like if it's unclear to what community, I mean, sorry, you're not asking the question, Barb is asking the question. Sorry. Okay, so I'm gonna assume that the question is about, well, I actually can't assume that I know what the question is about. I think that, that's one of the things that makes repatriation a very complicated process, is that one first has to identify who the community of descent is. And in the case of the Philippines, that's not always explicitly clear that one group that we can point to now that occupies and claims ancestral ties to a place is necessarily the group that has always been there, or that there's not a competing, that there's a kind of contest, right? And that's what makes it so challenging. So in terms of how difficult it is, I think it's quite difficult. But I think that's why the work of exploring and understanding what different ethno-linguistic groups' approaches are and feelings are and attitudes are towards these objects is really important.
Barb followed up with a clarification. She meant within a particular community that you're working with. How hard is it to get agreement?
Oh, within a particular community. That, I can't really say, because we're only at the beginning of, identifying who should be at the table of these conversations. And so I don't want to misspeak and, represent any particular community in any way. But thank you. Roxana has a question. Oh, there's another question in the audience.
Okay, go ahead.
Christine asks, you mentioned indigenous knowledges. Do you know what tribe Mateo Francisco might belong to, or which nation/tribe would be engaged in dreaming as an indigenous epistemology?
Oof. Sounds like that person should be part of the project. This is a really good example of where, again, the work is really complicated. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there is a description of who Mateo Francisco's parents are and what ethno-linguistic group they come from. However, that description comes from Dean Worcester, right? So you're suddenly in a position where you're having to read, or where the information that you're provided that names the specific group is coming from a colonialist. Now, we do know that Mateo Francisco came from a certain part of the Philippines, which is Siocon Bay in Zamboanga, in the Zamboanga Peninsula. But, you know, that doesn't immediately tell you what ethno-linguistic group he or his family might have belonged to. Can I just go forth though and say something else about Mateo Francisco? So, is anyone wondering like what happened to him? Well, I don't think we know yet. I think we have to do more research in order to know when he finished, when his last collaboration and when his last work with U of M faculty took place. We know that he was working with Goethe in the 1920s. But the other day, because I really wanted to, you know, try to approach it from the Philippines angle, I went down a little Google rabbit hole, and I discovered that there is a barangay, which is, a barangay is the smallest kind of municipal unit in the Philippines. There is a barangay called Mateo Francisco that is in Siocon, in Zamboanga, and that the barangay was named after Mateo Francisco by his grandson that has a different surname. And so, you know, we could like go and try to track down the descendants of Mateo Francisco, which is something that I would love to do. Anyway, sorry, I just had to get that in somehow. It's like somebody asked me about what happened to Mateo Francisco, please. And if nobody asked me, I'm just going to put it out there. There is a barangay that is named after him in Zamboanga.
So there was a question over here. Is there another question?
Roxana had a question
Roxana?
too, I think.
Hello, my name is Regina. I'm a sophomore at the university studying Spanish and history. And so my question was specifically like with the Philippines, with its prior colonial history with the Spaniards, how does that affect, or to what extent does it affect like the work of repatriation and this project?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I quite understand. I mean, are you talking about how the Spanish might have reorganized communities, and so then how does that affect being able to identify? Right there. That's a great question. There's no doubt that you know, the Spanish worked through the reorganization of communities according to what's known as the cabecera visita kind of complex, where you have the attempt to centralize populations around like a kind of church/municipal center. And so, yeah, that long history of kind of forced settlement could have some implications for being able to identify the communities of descent to which something like the human remains, which we know are, you know, quite old. They date back over 1,000 years in a lot of cases, if I'm not mistaken. But most of them are really quite old. So that does have, that question of the forced settlement of a population does have implications for being able to identify those communities. That's a good question. It's a great question. Thanks.
In the back.
Thank you very much, Deidre. I cannot express my happiness with this type of project given the frustrations that I have with the archives of University of Michigan on the Middle East and what could be perceived as the Middle East. My question is more of a curiosity, because we were talking a lot about gathering these archives and creating inventories, colonial inventories for these archives. I was wondering about activating these archives by the University of Michigan through its museums and thus through its exhibitions. So we are thinking about archives as, you know, we have this idea of an archive as something in a space that is being kept there in particular conditions in order for the items not to deteriorate. But sometimes these objects, these artifacts become objects of education and exhibitions.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you looked into that, whether you saw the history of the University of Michigan and its museums and how they created narratives in these exhibitions, whether they were trying to create, or whether they were trying to do some form of reparative work, anything that is in relation to museums and their educational aim.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think Kirsten Barn is probably the better person to answer that question. I mean, I do know that there were, you know, like the Tamarau, right, was part of the university museum. So when there have been times in this history where some of these things have been exhibited, what I was thinking more while you were talking was, you know, how these archives and museum collections, which are not generally exhibit museums, how they could be reimagined or reinterpreted. And I'm thinking really specifically not just of the actual artifacts themselves, but like the work that the artists that we brought last year, you know, could be doing with the collections, right? That to me is a really exciting sort of prospect and project, and not just with them specifically, but just more generally, you know, how would artists reinterpret the archive and the museum collections, recontextualize it, turn it on its head, and essentially decolonize them through their own creative work and their creative process, and through exhibition. So I think before, frankly, I'll just say, before seeing, you know, a number of like ceramic jugs, you know, like on display, I'm being really crass right now, but you know, I mean, I would sooner have that, but then maybe contextualize with other artistic interpretations of the collections. And yeah, boy, would we love to do everything, but you know, there's only so much time. But yeah, it's definitely something that we've thought about, and then I think would be really wonderful. Thank you.
I think we have one over here. Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry. Thanks, Austin.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I'm an undergrad planning on minoring in museum studies. As far as like redoing the labeling, would it be more of a note on like why certain terms are like bad or like ahistorical, or is it more of like a complete getting rid of like any harmful ideation in those, and sort of like what is the value of like, I guess, preserving the history of erasure?
That's a great question.
And like how does that fit into this?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're getting some good training in that museum studies program, let me tell you. I think that's a great question, and that's actually a conversation that I remember having really early on about, you know, finding alternative terminologies that then would like replace existing terminologies. And I think it was actually Una Paredes, who's one of our external advisory board members, and she's a professor at UCLA. She was the one who said, you know, but you can't ignore those layers, right? You shouldn't ignore those layers of colonial history and colonial collecting. So I think, I'm not sure exactly where the reparative description folks are at with that thinking, but I think that, you know, I think there's arguments to be made for both, but I think I would lean more towards, you know, I would definitely lean more towards not doing anything that somehow erases that history, right? And that history is a really important part of the collection. Great question.
From online?
Raquel asks, are there any plans to host or sponsor scholars from the Philippines who have research related to the Reconnect, Recollect project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's one of the things that we want to do potentially with residency in the spring. I should say that there are opportunities, that there are some fellowships that are, like the Bentley has a fellowship. I know the Center for Southeast Asian Studies has a fellowship for scholars from the Philippines or from the Philippines to come and engage the collections. So right now, there's not really a concrete plan to bring just scholars. I think the idea with the spring is that it would be a combination of bringing scholars and artists and other cultural practitioners. But yeah, I mean, would that the university might endow something that could then bring regular scholars from the Philippines? Is anybody listening? That would be really great. So we do have a tentative plan in the works now. But yeah, having access, that's a really important piece of it, is making sure that these collections are accessible for people who want to use them, most especially from the Philippines.
Over here. Okay.
Hi, Professor De La Cruz. I'm Madeline.
Hi, Madeline.
I'm a student at the University of Michigan. I really enjoyed learning about the 3 pillars, the reparative actions that this collection is taking to address those silences and erasure you were talking about. And I was wondering, what were some of the challenges you faced in addressing those silences, and having gone through the project, what do you think were some of the best practices that helped you go through that difficult process?
Oh, I missed the last part. Best practices for?
In going through that difficult process of going through the archives and addressing those silences and the erasure that you were mentioning before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are other people in the room better equipped to answer that for some of the specific material that I presented. So, you know, Kirsten has done the research on Mateo Francisco. I have another student now that's doing some of that research. But, you know, generally speaking, it's really challenging. There's a lot of, you know, historical writing on silences in the archive and how they reflect power structures. And so there's a lot of reading at right angles to sources that has to happen in order to even be able to discern that there is a silence, right? And then the question is, well, then how do you, you know, try to not fill it, as in like pour something in it, but then how do you try to draw out from archival sources something that remediates that silence? It's a tough question, and I think it's one that I think about a lot with this archive, because really there are so few Filipino voices, and I mean, proportional to the vast number of sources and the number of collections that pertain to the colonial Philippines, there are really very few Filipino voices in these archives. And you know, part of it maybe is just that not enough people have done the research and, you know, really looked for that specifically. So maybe they're like false silences. But there's no question that, yeah, the silences, especially of, you know, subjugated peoples, is always there. I mean, and I even think like with this archive, the Filipino voices that we do have are elite voices often, right? So what about the voices of those who, you know, have these, again, what I think of as lived experiences of empire, but who don't appear in the colonial record? And then I think, well, maybe it's better that there are actually Filipino subjects that, you know, historically have not actually been, sorry, I'm getting on like a kind of like a sort of theoretical track here. But in any case, yes, silences in archival research is a real challenge. Thanks.
Hi, Professor De La Cruz.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan, everybody.
Jonathan Valdez.
Yes, I'm staff here at the university, and I guess my question is, what are efforts for folks in STEM, since there's a lot of animal and plant and both terrestrial and marine aspects of the collection? How are folks in STEM being engaged right now with the Reconnect, Recollect project, and what does that sort of look? What do you sort of think that looks like in terms of reparative work?
That is a great question that I'm not sure we've really addressed yet. I mean, there is someone who is working in not you know, directly in the Reconnect project, but we have been having conversations with a student who is doing work at the Matay Botanical Gardens. I don't have, I mean, it's an opportunity, for sure. It's an opportunity. But I don't know, I think we'd have to, do a lot of sort of brainstorming to think about how best to engage STEM students. Or if there are any STEM students who want to be involved and, then please, I mean, it would be really fantastic. Because it's true, most of the collections that we're talking about are the archival or the archaeological collections. But there are, as you see, in that infographic, thousands and thousands and thousands of mammal species. Mollusks are my personal favorite. How to engage those in a kind of reparative way is a fascinating question that is maybe for the next Reconnect 2.0. But thanks for that question.
Anybody else? Here?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a junior undergrad, and I'm part of the Filipino American Student Association on campus. I really liked to hear about the advisory team of community members that you built with Reconnect, Recollect. And I'd like to know how you built those connections and how you built trust with them, and how they engage with the archives.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it was really essential. We recognized early on that we had an external advisory board. A lot of our board members are people who are from our own broader network of Philippine and Filipino scholars, so Philippine-based and Filipino, and then U.S.-based Filipino and Filipino-American scholars. But we do have, the person we consider our community elder, Deling Weller, was the Filipino language teacher here. So I think that, part of it was just through our own professional and personal networks. And I think that, at least our engagement with the external advisory board has been one where, they feel really forthright to be able to say what they think and, what are some of the things that they think that we should do. And we take that advisement really seriously. I think that's the best way that I can answer that question. There are a lot of other people that we could have had on the advisory board, and I think as we move forward with some of these more challenging conversations, we'll expand, that advisory board even further. But yeah, always having people outside of the institution, I think, is really key, because it becomes easy to kind of just be internally looking. And, people who are in the Philippines as well is also really, really key. Thank you.
Maybe one more if there's anybody. Okay, well, Deirdre, thank you so much.
This has been so great.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the audience here and online. Appreciate the questions and discussion. I want to thank Andrew Rutledge for monitoring YouTube and the Michigan media team for their work. We're open every Friday for Astronomy Night, so please come visit us. I am working on Making Michigan for November. It's not quite set yet, so please stay tuned and keep your eyes open for that. This session tonight will be available online in about a week, posted online. For those of you here, stick around if you'd like. We have student docents upstairs who do a wonderful job of explaining the observatory and showing things. Unfortunately, I don't think the weather is cooperating tonight in terms of observing, but please feel free to go upstairs to the observatory and see it. It's a lot of fun.
It's still very cool, even if you're not looking at it.
That's right.
It's very cool.
And again, for the people online, I hope that you can join us here sometime. So thank you all, and be safe and stay well. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
That was great. Thank you so much. That was excellent.